So, yes, if it's hard to say anything about the prospects, what about the obstacles, or what do you see as the main obstacles in our society and the main elements of power that has to be challenged or overcome if the demands of movements like the Occupy movement are to succeed?
Well, again, it somewhat differs in different societies, but there's a lot similar. For one thing, there is, throughout the Western world, there's highly concentrated economic power, which therefore carries with it very strong political power. There are forces of repression which can be mobilized to prevent popular movements from developing, but they're relatively fragile. It's not like a fascist state, so they're fragile and they can be undermined by popular resistance. They're not simple, but it can be done, has been done. So, for example, take, say, the civil rights movement. In the South, where it took off, repression was really vicious. I mean, it was like fascist states. I recall demonstrations there, which were beaten demonstrators. I mean, people were killed. It wasn't a joke. But it made some significant progress. But the major problem, I think, is kind of a combination of hopelessness and apathy. It's hard to distinguish between them. But for most of the population thinks nothing can be done. That shows in pretty remarkable ways. So, for example, I'll keep to the United States. The attitudes towards systems of power are quite remarkable. So, approval of Congress is in literally single digits. Probably most of the population thinks they ought to be thrown out. Presidential candidates, not much higher. Banks, hated. Corporations, despised. Almost anything, any institution you can pick. People don't like it. They think it's just harming them. But they don't think they can do anything about it. Sometimes it's almost surreal. Like take what's called here the 9/11 movement, the truth movement. People who think that the Bush administration was responsible for 9/11. It's a substantial part of the population. And probably about a third of the population thinks it's at least plausible, maybe true. So that means, say, a third of the population thinks that we're governed by people who are homicidal maniacs who want to murder us all. But we can't do anything about it. So you believe it, and then you try to go on with your daily life. And this sense that everything's hopeless is a very good technique of control. You can understand the sense. I mean, the labor movement's been significantly destroyed, not totally, but largely. Other popular institutions barely exist. If some action takes place in the United States, say a talk or some organizing event or something, takes place either at a university or a church, because that's all there is. If you go to other countries, you can often meet in a union hall or something, but nothing like that exists here. So people are very atomized. They're very separated from one another. They're burdened with debt. They're indoctrinated from infancy with consumerist culture. You can only evaluate your own determine who you are and what value you have, how many commodities you have. So people are separated from one another. There's very little interaction. Well, that does contribute to a sense of hopelessness. And that's a good technique of indoctrination and control, and that has to be overcome. People have to get to feel that they can do something. Every organizer knows this. I mean, if you're trying to organize whatever, say an anti-poverty campaign or a campaign against electoral fraud or whatever it is in the inner city, one of the things you really have to start with is something simple. Get people together to see if they can maybe get a traffic light put up in a street where children have to cross the street to go to school, and get to work on that. And if you can achieve that, you get a sense, well, we can achieve something, then you can go on to something else. But that's the way organizing always works.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the sitting at the lunch counter was an example. Let's see if we can get the right to have a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. And if we can get that, we can go on to something bigger, and it's, you look at the history of social movements, it's interesting to see how they work.
Yeah,
The civil rights movement is an interesting case. It did achieve a lot, but it hit a barrier that it couldn't cross. Take Martin Luther King. If you listen to the speeches on Martin Luther King Day, extolling his great achievement, they end in 1963 with a speech, I Have a Dream speech, which everybody knows. But Martin Luther King didn't stop in 1963. He went on to try to face class issues. And as soon as he did that, he was driven out of polite society and made no progress on that. In fact, the day he was assassinated, he was on his way to organize a march to Washington try to start a poor people's movement. And after his assassination, the march took place. His wife led it, his widow. It got to Washington. They set up a tent city, Resurrection City, and Congress, which is the most liberal Congress in American history, quickly called out the police. They came in the middle of the night, drove them out, destroyed the city, drove them all out of town. And that's what happens when you try to face class issues. Mm. So, and that's not, that part of his life is never discussed, virtually never discussed.
Mm. So this leads to my second question. It touches a lot on the things that I was going to ask you, because we've been learning about the healthcare system here and the healthcare system, and I'm quite surprised about the big differences that there is compared to where I'm from, Denmark.
Compared to anywhere.
Yeah.
The United States is unique in the industrial world.
So I want to ask, how come, since you have had such great characters and movements, like you mentioned King and many others, that there is such a big difference between the
U.S. is to an unusual extent a business-run society. I mean, all Western societies are basically business-run, but the U.S. is extreme, and it has been for 150 years. And one consequence of that is that benefit systems, wealth support systems, are much weaker in the United States than in Europe or Australia, Canada, any industrial country. And it shows up in other ways. I mean, just take salaries of professionals and CEOs, heads of corporations. I mean, they're ridiculously high everywhere, but in the United States, they're in the stratosphere. And the power of, if you take a look at the elections. I mean, elections, they're not wonderful anywhere, but in the United States, you can pretty well predict the outcome of an election just by the amount of campaign funding. And you can pretty well predict the policies by the concentration of campaign funding. That's been pretty well studied, incidentally, in some of the best kind of left political science literature. And it's quite remarkable, which means that elections basically don't take place. The campaign funding, of course, comes overwhelmingly from the corporate sector and the wealthy. So they essentially buy the elections. And the result is you get policies that reflect their interests, but not the interests of the population. So take healthcare again. For a long time, 50 years or more, the public has pretty much supported some kind of national healthcare system. What people usually say is a Canadian-style system, and not because Canada is so great, but that's the only country anybody knows exists. It's a very insular country. If you ask people where Denmark is, half of them will say it's in Africa, literally. So it's a very internally directed country, so you know that Canada exists. So people say a Canadian-style system, which is okay, but not the best by any means. But they just can't get through. I mean, when in the current debate over the healthcare system, there was one residue of a national healthcare system. It was called a public option. So like one of the choices would be, can people choose to be in a public system? It was about almost 2-to-1 support for that, but Obama didn't even try. He didn't try. He just abandoned it quickly. And that's the power of the financial institutions. The United States is, I think, the only country in the world, as far as I know, where there are laws that say that the government can't negotiate drug prices. So drug prices are 2 to 3 times as high as they are anywhere else. You go look for some favorite drug in the local pharmacy, you'll see it's way higher than it is in Denmark, because the government can't negotiate prices. Well, that's the power of the pharmaceutical industry. And in a business-run society, that's what you get. Strong centers of power, enormously influential in government and elsewhere, so people can't get a public health care system even if they want it. Because it's not the only case, but public policy usually is very different from public opinion. You can see that by checking polls. Healthcare is a striking example. Healthcare is a very important example, not only for human reasons. It's tens of millions of people who have no access to healthcare, except in an emergency room, but also just in straight economic terms. I mean, for example, if the United States had a healthcare system comparable to, say, Denmark or any other society, there wouldn't be a deficit at all. There'd be a surplus. But even that doesn't matter. In fact, if you read the press, it's never been talked about. Obama's program, improves things a little, but nothing like other countries, and nothing like what the public wants. And it is a disaster.
Yeah. So how? I guess it's a question of priorities, and we all have to make up our own mind. But a lot of the activism that I've been engaged in Denmark, and a lot of the people I know, is very critical towards the state and state power. It's very critical towards state power, or very focused on limiting the power of the state. But isn't that a bit dangerous in a society like
it's
here?
It's very dangerous in a society which has strong private power. And private power, state power is bad enough. Private power is a lot worse. State power is at least partially accountable to the public. Private power is totally unaccountable to the public. Like, you can vote to influence who your representative will be in Parliament, but you can't vote for what the major corporations will do. That's in principle. So, and in fact, if you didn't, so yes, I'm opposed to state power too, but you have to recognize there's another major power there. Actually, there's an image that I once borrowed from the rural workers in Brazil. The Rural Workers Union had an image about living in a cage. They say we're living in a cage, and what we can do is try to broaden, push the bars farther out, but we also need the cage. I mean, if there's a saber-toothed tiger outside, you want the cage, even if you don't like cages. Well, we're living in a cage with unaccountable private power there, and unless we have some government partially accountable institution that can protect us from it, it'll be a total disaster.
So how do we reduce the power of corporations?
I think they just ought to be. There already are movements, and they ought to be expanded to just move to a community and worker-owned corporation. No corporations, worker and community-owned enterprises. No reason why. I mean, there are some that exist, and some quite successful. Like, take, say, Spain. Everyone knows Spain has so-called, problems, fiscal problems, unemployment problems. Not entirely. Mondragon doesn't. That's the biggest worker-owned collective in the world. It's quite huge, and they're doing okay. They obviously are affected by the recession, but not unemployment. The banks, the hospitals, the schools, everything worked. And there's no reason why that can't be expanded over the whole society. In fact, that's being done to an extent. Like in the United States, too, it's not massive, but there's a growth of worker-owned enterprises. It was just an agreement made between Mondragon and the Steelworkers Union in the United States to try to expand similar enterprises here. But it could be, with enough popular organization, it could work. So a couple of years ago, Obama basically nationalized the banks and the auto industry. That's what it amounted to. The bailouts are basically nationalization. So it means the public owned them. Well, what happened? They were given back to their original owners, or people very much like them, at public expense. But another possibility would have been to turn them over to the workforce. And if the Occupy movement had existed and been powerful enough, it could have pressed it. So these are things that could be, they're not utopian. They're on the border of possibility. They want to.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your time.
Good to see you.
You
You too.
Have a good trip.